Felty. We're ready to start again. I want you to hear what I heard. I heard that he was going to put into his proposal a waiting list initiative. I also heard that he was going to, I'm trying to remember his words right now. I was asking Andrew, do something about our issue about jobs that pay. I also know that we will have a time with his folks, his analysts, which is an incredibly good sign, to work through what it would take, whether it is a multi-year initiative, but certainly with a boost this year. As you know, the governor makes his proposed budget, what he would like to see happen, and then it goes to the General Assembly and legislators. And we have, as you know, a Democratic governor, and we have a Republican-controlled legislature, and so we will have to build the legislature. The first task, though, is the governor's commitment. So we will work to solidify that commitment. We certainly believe that he wants to help. He's learning how to help. He's learning how serious it is. So we need to do everything we can. The DSPs for a day, that will make a huge difference, I am sure, as you reach out and you bring in your legislators to help them really understand what this work is, because people have not known. And it does transform people's thinking. So let's take this day, move it forward, and ensure that we help create this change. It is my real privilege to introduce Dennis Felty to kick off the next segment of our celebration. Dennis worked in the institutions, and he developed a passion that has lasted his whole life to get people out of restrictive environments and support people to live valued lives integrated in our communities with the services and supports that they need. Recently, well, it's been a little while now, he took the last people out of one of the state institutions and turned the key in the lock for the last time. Incredible experience. I was there that afternoon to celebrate. Dennis was a witness to the conditions in Pennsylvania's institutions in the late 1980s, 60s, and he personally knew and worked with Stan Miller and Dr. Joseph Adelstein. Who were they? Stan Miller and Dr. Joseph Adelstein were the architects of the Mental Health and Intellectual Disability Act of 1966. So it's fitting that Keystone Human Services that was founded in 1968, is the educational sponsor of this event, and that Dennis Felty, its founding president, will begin the stories. Over these years, Keystone has grown to provide a wide range of services in autism, intellectual disability, mental health, early intervention services, and Head Start programs. Keystone is an international organization serving individuals in community-based services in Pennsylvania, Connecticut, and Delaware. And as a global advocate for people with disability, Keystone has major initiatives in the Republic of Moldova and the Republic of India. Dennis also serves on Governor Wolf's Advisory Commission on Health and served on both Governor Wolf's and Governor Corbett's transition team. I am delighted at this time to turn the podium over to Dennis, where we will hear what he has to say.
Well, Shirley, thank you very much for those kind remarks. And the governor is always a difficult act to follow, but I'll do my best. 2 weeks ago, my wife Barb and I were really honored in terms of a event that was hosted by Keystone in terms of recognizing our 45 years of involvement with Keystone. And many of you here today were actually part of that. And that was a greatly appreciated gift. But one of the individuals that was there that evening is a friend of 45 years whose name is Sandy Cooper. And Sandy gave me permission to tell our story that night, as well as to share that story with you today. Ms. Cooper, Sandy, was sent to the Pennhurst State Center when she was 13 years old. And her family photographs show that she was just an absolutely beautiful young girl. She lived at Pennhurst for about another 12 years, and when she was 25 years old, she started to hear about some of these brand new community programs that were starting. And she had someone at Pennhurst that helped her write a letter to me. And in that letter, she said that she wanted to leave Pennhurst, and she asked for my help in her being able to achieve that dream. Remarkably, Sandy was able to come to Harrisburg, by bus, and we were the same age and really hit it off, and was able to offer her the opportunity to live at a brand new apartment program in the Pineford Apartments in Middletown, and she accepted and moved into that program. And we've remained friends for those 45 years, and she continues to write notes and letters, but most of these these days end up going to Barb instead of myself. Now, Sandy, like so many, is really an extraordinary hero. Soon after she left Pennhurst and moved into the Pineford Apartments, I had a chance to visit Pennhurst for the first time. And that memory is still emotionally powerful. I remember the day room, and I think there were probably 200 people in the day room just milling around. And what was so impactful was the screams and the crying and the moaning. I mean, a real cacophony of sounds that you had never heard before. And the incredible stench that was so overwhelming. I can still experience that today. And that reality that existed was absolutely a nightmare directly out of Dante's Inferno. And the notion and understanding that people have been able to live in these conditions and survive in them, is really an extraordinary part of this story. Now, Sandy lives in a really beautiful home outside of Hershey, and before the Keystone event on the previous Monday, I went out to visit her to ask her permission to tell the story. And we were sitting down at the table, and I made my request, and she started to tell me all of the things that were done to her at Pennhurst. And I knew many of them, but I didn't know all of them. And it was an extraordinarily painful experience to hear. I thought I would get get through this, but for all of us, when you hear those stories, it really is extraordinarily painful. And when she finished telling those experiences, she took my hand, and in response to my question, she said, "Yes, you got me out of the state school." So, it's really been a profound privilege to know people like Sandy and really to walk the path of life for such a long time, for 45 years. Few of us here today would be able to endure the torment, the neglect, the horror of Pennhurst and its sister sites. However, Sandy's story, as we know, has been shared by thousands of people. And over these many years, each story is an incredible story about courage, endurance, grace, and forgiveness. Now, all of you are here today because you have shared this path with someone that you're directly involved with you. Some have personally experienced this story. Others are family members that have walked this path with a loved one. And many of you are advocates and professionals that have used your own freedom to work for the freedom for others within this effort. Now, we are here because we all stand on the shoulder of giants, people who were really courageous, who looked at this situation, said that it's wrong, and made decisions to really do something and begin to create changes, that would help people with disability who are having these circumstances imposed on them, have better lives. Now, Pennhurst, was not unique. There was no master list or database at the time of the 60,000 people in Pennsylvania that were living in psychiatric hospitals and state centers. And so as a young executive director, and there are probably a few of you here that shared this experience, that it was actually necessary to go out to the state centers visiting and literally roaming around. I would go to state centers looking for people from Dauphin County and would be able then to offer the opportunity to leave the institution and return home to the community. The conditions, I think, were so awful that they really traumatized the visitors and the observers as well. I'd worked at the Harrisburg State Hospital prior to becoming involved with Keystone, and the disturbing exposures to these conditions, both at Harrisburg State Hospital and in visiting a huge number of Pennsylvania's institutions as Keystone's director, was really quite a profound experience. And what were the conditions like? It was common that 100 people would share a bedroom. There were many cases where there would be wall-to-wall beds, and literally to get to your bed, you had to crawl across other people's beds. Often people would not be provided with clothing, and we called that denudative behavior at the time. Electroconvulsive shock was used as punishment. There was nude seclusion for days and weeks on end, sometimes months on end. Surgery was often done on site and often without anesthesia. There were gang showers with hoses. Children at the Polk State Center and other state centers were kept in cages. People that would bite in self-defense would have their teeth extracted. There was absolutely no protection under the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. There was no due process around the commitment process. When people died, they frequently would be buried in the field out back without ceremony or without marker. And every imaginable form of neglect and physical and sexual abuse and assault was common, and especially at night within the institutions. This is an example of some of what was typical of institutions all the way across the United States at this period. At this time, there were probably 600,000 people living in institutions like this in the United States. So why do I show you these photos, and why do I tell you this story? That this is from where we come. This is our origin. This is our starting point for all the work that you do and what has been accomplished over these years. This is really part of our story, and it's part of the story that must never, ever, ever be forgotten. The new documentary film that I Go Home, that will be shown here at the conference, does a fabulous job of documenting this history and this circumstance. And also the Pennhurst Memorial website is a treasure trove of information on this period and the circumstances that led up to it in the history of disability within the United States. Now, much of my material today deals with historical language, and I've taken the liberty of changing that language to current person-centered language as part of this presentation. So what brought us to this profoundly disturbing situation that existed at the end of the 1960s. Why are you here today? In order to answer that question, we have to go back to the early 1900s, and it was a time when there was huge technological advances being made in genetics around the breeding of cattle, horses, chickens, and other agricultural products. And beginning around 1905, people began to think that because this was so successful within farming, that we should begin thinking about applying this technology to humans as a way of really improving society. That at that time, it began to emerge that there was very broad-based belief that people experiencing disabilities were actually the cause of almost all of the emerging social ills in the United States, including poverty and criminal behavior. This movement came to be known as eugenics. Now, the definition of eugenics is a set of beliefs and practices aimed at improving the genetic quality of the human population through the promotion of higher rates of reproduction of people with desired traits, that's positive eugenics, and reduced rates of reproduction of people with less desired traits, negative eugenics. Now, eventually, negative eugenics would emerge to include sterilization, castration, segregation, incarceration, and extermination. The American eugenics movement was really the driving force in what eventually became a global eugenics movement. And it's important to understand that in the United States, this was not a movement that was driven by a few radicals or that was some sort of shadowy background kind of ideology or social movement. It was broadly supported in all aspects of society, all levels of government, very much in the open, and just had absolutely broad-based support by universities, state governments, and the general public. This is a fantastic, I'm just intrigued by this photograph that at this time, if you were thinking about getting married, you could take your fiance to a eugenics center, particularly at a state fair. This is at the Kansas State Fair, and you could get an assessment. The people standing around the couple sitting in the center are the assessors, and then the assessors determine whether you were genetically fit to reproduce. And then if you were, they would actually issue a pedigree that you could show your fiance or that you could keep and show that you were in fact quality genetically, or you had genetic quality and were in fact certified to reproduce. This shows the actual newspaper article where this photograph occurred, and you can see if you look on the porch in the back left corners, it's the governor's trophy for fittest family, and so the family sitting in the center is determined to be the winning family, and it was called a fitter family, and it became incredibly positive event. And you can see the article is actually written by a state senator, and so that kind of reinforces the notion that this was really something that was just broadly supported. Now, this family was determined, was perceived as being one of an exquisitely fit family within its culture. Does anybody you recognize who it is? Yeah, this is Joseph and Magna Goebbels' family, and Goebbels, of course, was the Reich Minister of Propaganda under the Nazi government. And this is an example. They were really perceived as an exquisite example of almost a perfect family, from a standpoint of eugenics. And one of the tragedies of this story is that the Magna and Joseph Goebbels ended up killing all of their children, as the Russians advanced on Berlin at the end of this movement. The degree to which the Nazis took eugenics, that as people are well aware that almost every individual with a disability in Nazi Germany was medically killed in the T4 program. And the Nazi Germany ended up taking eugenics so far that it ended up completely discrediting the movement. And then also in the 1940s, research indicated that some of the assumptions that the movement was based on were completely invalid, if not totally fraudulent. Many of the 26 states in the United States passed mandatory sterilization laws, and this is just an example of Iowa that you can see as late as 1960, people were still being sterilized because of their disability or social condition. Initially, the sterilizations were mandatory, without informed consent, but eventually there was consent required, but often if you were placed in an institution, in order to be discharged, you had to agree to sterilization. What happened then with the collapse of the eugenics movement in the 1940s, United States was left with almost 600,000 people living in psychiatric hospitals and state schools. And there was no longer any justification, but there was also no alternative at the time. And there was almost, I think we entered into a period of abandonment where the institutions even declined further in terms of their conditions and their care. Now, early in my career, I had the privilege to work with Dr. Joseph Adelstein. While still an employee at the Harrisburg State Hospital, I was part of a staff sharing project with the brand new community mental health center that was being developed at the Harrisburg General Hospital. And Dr. Adelstein had left his position as commissioner for mental health in Pennsylvania and was the medical director at the Harrisburg Hospital Mental Health and Intellectual Disability Center. This next slide is an interview of Dr. Adelstein that was done as part of the film that we did on With a Voice Comes Understanding.
What was needed was not so much treatment for many of these patients as looking at them as people who had, for one reason or another, either been deprived or lost their skills in living in the type of competitive society, social structure that we had, and needed actually both a combination of retraining in social skills, but also an opportunity to live in environments that were supportive, understanding, and appreciative of the kinds of difficulties they were struggling with, and provided opportunities for them to live and grow and develop and live up to their maximum potentials in spite of their disabilities.
Now, Dr. Adelstein is really one of the giants of our movement. Prior to serving as medical director at the Harrisburg Hospital Community Mental Health Center, Dr. Adelstein served as commissioner for mental health and intellectual disability in Pennsylvania 2 times. And in both of those terms, he was responsible for all of the institutional services in Pennsylvania, as well as the whole mental health and intellectual disability program and services. Now, during Adelstein's first term as commissioner, it was under Governor Bill Scranton starting in June of 1963. And in this role, Adelstein was the actual architect of the Mental Health and Intellectual Disability Act of 1966. Now, Adelstein left his post soon after the act passing and to work within the private sector. And at that time, I'm pretty sure there was very little implementation of the act. There were huge problems around funding, around structure and staffing, and it was a period where there was not an awful lot of progress made within its implementation. Now, beginning in 1963, Raymond Schaefer served as Governor Bill Scranton's lieutenant governor, and then Raymond Schaefer went on to win the Pennsylvania governorship in January of '67. During the campaign, Schaefer's running mate was killed in an aviation accident, and Ray Broderick was named to replace him on the ticket as lieutenant governor. And it's more than interesting to note that Lieutenant Governor Broderick was the person that Bill Baldini took the Suffer the Little Children film from and the early footage that he did at Pennhurst. He literally knocked on Broderick's door and asked to set up his projector in his living room and showed him the film that evening. And the story is that Broderick was deeply moved and appalled at the image that he saw. Now, it's quite incredible that in 1971, Broderick was appointed as federal judge by President Nixon and served on the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. And he, of course, then was the judge who actually heard Haldeman versus Pennhurst. Adelstein then was asked to return for a second term then as commissioner under the Schaefer administration in June of 1960.